I stood across the aisle in King County Superior Court and watched my husband Caleb smirk at his flashy lawyer. 2 weeks ago, that man barged into my boardroom and humiliated me with divorce papers. They think they are suing a helpless wife for 50% of my company, but they have no idea what is inside the yellow envelope in my bag. It is not a settlement offer. It is the evidence that will send them both to prison. My name is Eleanor Stark, and right now, I am the calmest person in this freezing courtroom. The air inside the King County Superior Court smells of old oak and lemon polish, a scent designed to mask the odor of decaying marriages. I sat with my spine pressed against the hard wooden bench, my hands folded perfectly on the table. At 34 years old, I am the CEO of Helix Dynamics, a company that is changing the way the world grows food in arid climates. I am not the weeping, discarded wife they expect. I am a scientist, and I am currently observing a parasite in its natural habitat. I looked across the aisle at Caleb Montgomery. He wore the charcoal suit I paid for, his hair styled to project an image of innocent suffering. To the world, he is a charming former pro golfer, though he never actually made the tour. To me, he is a narcissist who drained my energy for 5 years. Next to him sat Marcus Thorne, a lawyer whose reputation for dirty tactics is well known in Seattle. Thorne wore a grin that was all teeth, the same expression he wore 2 weeks ago when he decided to ruin my reputation. The memory of that day still burned in my chest like acid. I was in the middle of a quarterly review with my top 3 investors. We were discussing yield projections. Suddenly, the glass doors of the conference room flew open. Thorne marched in, ignoring my assistant's protests, and threw a stack of papers onto the mahogany table. They slid across the polished surface and stopped right in front of the lead investor. "You are served, Mrs. Stark," Thorne had announced, his voice booming so everyone could hear. "My client is filing for divorce on the grounds of financial infidelity. You cannot hide marital assets in a shell company forever." I remembered the silence that followed. I remembered the way my CFO looked down at his shoes and the way the investors exchanged nervous glances. In 10 seconds, Thorne had stripped away the professional armor I had spent a decade building. He made me look like a thief. He made me look like a liar. That was his mistake. If he had just mailed the papers, we might have settled. But he wanted a show. Now, I was going to give him a finale. "All rise," the bailiff shouted, snapping me back to the present. Judge Patricia Halloway swept into the room. She was a woman with a reputation for shredding theatrics. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes scanned the room with bored precision. We sat down. Thorne stood up to deliver his opening statement. He buttoned his jacket and walked toward the bench, exuding unearned confidence. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice smooth and practiced. "This is a simple case of a partnership betrayed. While Ms. Stark is indeed the public face of Helix Dynamics, the evidence will show that my client, Mr. Montgomery, was the silent investor. He was the emotional and intellectual bedrock upon which this company was built. He sacrificed his own promising career in sports to support his wife's dream. I felt my lawyer, Sarah, stiffen beside me, but I did not move. Thorne continued, pacing back and forth. We intend to prove that Ms. Stark used joint funds our client's savings to launch her startup, and now that the company is worth millions, she is attempting to funnel those assets into hidden accounts to deny Mr. Montgomery his rightful share. We are asking for an equitable distribution. We are asking for 50% of Helix Dynamics. 50%. He wanted half of the blood and sweat I had poured into the lab while he was sleeping until noon. I turned my head slightly to look at Caleb. He wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at me. He offered a small, sad smile, the kind that used to make me apologize for things I hadn't done. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched up into a smirk. It was a look of pure victory. He thought he had me cornered. He thought the humiliation 2 weeks ago had broken me. I looked down at the table. My hand rested on a thick yellow manila envelope. Inside were documents that Caleb did not know existed. I did not smile back. I just tapped the envelope once with my index finger and waited. Sarah Jenkins stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. She did not pace like Thorne. She stood like a statue carved from granite. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the humid tension of the room. "Mr. Montgomery claims to be a co-founder. We simply ask for proof of this intellectual contribution. Surely, the brain behind a biotech firm knows the difference between a gene sequence and a grocery list." Caleb took the stand, looking appropriately humble. He adjusted the microphone. It wasn't formal. "Your Honor, it was pillow talk. Late nights. I gave her the confidence to push forward when she wanted to quit. I almost choked on the air in my lungs. The audacity was breathtaking. My mind flashed back to the reality of our partnership. It was the winter of 2016. I was working out of our unheated detached garage, wearing 3 sweaters because we could not afford a space heater. I worked 20 hours a day, pipetting solutions with numb fingers until my vision blurred. Where was Caleb? He was on a networking trip in Cabo San Lucas with his golf buddies, charging rounds of drinks to our maxed-out credit cards. I remembered the night I begged him for help. I needed a centrifuge. It cost $5,000. "Please, Caleb," I had said, standing in the kitchen with dark circles under my eyes. "If I can just buy this one piece of equipment, I can prove the concept." He had laughed, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "Ellie, give it up. I'm not draining our savings so you can play mad scientist. You're trying to grow vegetables for poor people. There is no money in feeding the hungry. Get a real job." I did not get a real job. Instead, I sold the vintage Buick my grandmother left me. I took out a loan with an interest rate of 25% from a lender who operated out of a strip mall. I built Helix Dynamics on my own back, while Caleb complained that I was neglecting my wifely duties. Back in the courtroom, Caleb wiped a fake tear from his eye. "We sacrificed so much time together for the science," he said. Thorne walked up to the witness stand holding a leather-bound notebook. "Mr. Montgomery, do you recognize this?" "Yes," Caleb said, his voice trembling slightly. "That is my idea journal from the early days." Thorne handed the journal to the judge. "As you can see, Your Honor, it contains sketches of cellular structures and notes on drought resistance." I leaned forward, squinting. I recognized that notebook. Caleb used it to keep score of his fantasy football leagues. He must have spent the last 2 weeks furiously copying diagrams from Wikipedia. I could see the pages from here. The terminology was all wrong. He had labeled a plant cell wall as a mitochondrial barrier. It was gibberish. "This is nonsense," I whispered to Sarah. "The science is completely wrong." "The judge doesn't know science, Eleanor," Sarah whispered back, not taking her eyes off Thorne. "She just sees a husband with a notebook." Sarah stood up to cross-examine. She tried to expose his ignorance. "Mr. Montgomery, can you explain the specific enzyme trigger used in the Helix protocol?" Caleb did not even blink. Thorne had prepped him well. "Ms. Jenkins, as the strategic visionary, I didn't get bogged down in the minutiae of the lab work. My role was conceptual. I guided the ship. Eleanor just shoveled the coal. It was a perfect non-answer. It painted me as the laborer and him as the architect. I felt a cold knot of fury tighten in my stomach. It was like watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Then, Thorne played his ace. "We have one more piece of evidence regarding the financial commencement of the company," Thorne said, pulling a document from his briefcase. He held it up like a weapon. "This is a certified bank statement from March of 2018. He placed it on the overhead projector. A line was highlighted in yellow. "As you can see," Thorne declared, "a transfer of $200,000 was made from Mr. Montgomery's personal account directly into the operating fund of Helix Dynamics." The room went silent. I stared at the screen. $200,000. I knew for a fact that Caleb never had that kind of money, and he certainly never gave it to me. But there it was, in black and white, a transaction that threatened to rewrite history and hand him half of my life's work. I stared at the projected image of the bank statement on the courtroom screen. The entry read Seed Capital, followed by the sum of $200,000. It was dated May 12th, 2018. My mind raced through the company ledgers faster than a supercomputer. I knew every cent that had ever entered or left Helix Dynamics. This transaction did not exist in my books, yet here it was on a bank document that looked terrifyingly authentic. I leaned over to Sarah, my knuckles white as I gripped the table. "Challenge the source," I whispered urgently. "He never had that money. He was borrowing cash from me for lunch in 2018. Sarah nodded imperceptibly and turned back to the witness stand. Her voice was ice cold, a surgical blade ready to cut. "Mr. Montgomery, $200,000 is a significant sum for a man who, according to joint tax returns from that year, reported an annual income of $18,000. Where exactly did this cash come from?" Caleb shifted in his seat. He looked at Thorne for a split second before answering. It was from private winnings, underground golf tournaments. I kept it in cash, under the mattress. You could say I didn't want to burden Eleanor with the tax details." "Cash," Sarah raised an eyebrow, her tone dripping with skepticism. "You kept $200,000 in a shoebox and then deposited it all at once." "Yes," Caleb said, regaining his composure and puffing out his chest. "I believed in my wife's dream, so I deposited it to help her start up. I bet on her." I grabbed Sarah's arm, my fingernails digging into her sleeve. The memory hit me like a physical blow, a specific, humiliating memory from that exact year. "Sarah," I hissed, keeping my voice low so only she could hear. In 2018, he was sued by American Express. He swore under oath he was insolvent to get the debt settled for pennies on the dollar. If he had 200 grand, he committed perjury then. If he didn't, he is committing perjury now. Sarah's eyes lit up with predatory delight. She pulled a file from her stack. It was the background check we had run on Caleb's financial history, a document we hadn't thought we would need until now. "Your Honor," Sarah announced, approaching the bench with renewed vigor, "I would like to submit Exhibit D. This is a court transcript from a debt collection hearing dated June 4th, 2018, less than 1 month after this alleged investment." She turned to Caleb, brandishing the paper. "Mr. Montgomery, did you not stand before a judge in this very building and declare yourself destitute to avoid paying a $12,000 credit card bill? You claimed you had 0 assets. So, were you lying to that judge, or are you lying to this one?" Caleb turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish pulled onto a dock. Thorne shot up from his chair, realizing his narrative was collapsing. "Objection relevancy. Past financial struggles do not negate the existence of the transfer overruled," Judge Holloway said, leaning forward, her eyes narrowing at Caleb. "Answer the question, Mr. Montgomery." Thorne cut in before Caleb could destroy himself. "Your Honor, my client's funds were held in trust, informal trust, to protect them from aggressive creditors. The transfer came from a third party acting on his behalf." Thorne gestured dramatically to the back of the room. "We call Gregory Vance to the stand." My heart sank. Greg, Caleb's drinking buddy and enabler. Greg walked up, swore the oath, and sat down. He looked greasy and nervous, wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big, but he stuck to the script. Yes, Greg said, avoiding my eyes and looking at the ceiling. Caleb gave me the cash to hold. I wrote the check to the company. It was his money. We moved it through my account to keep it safe. It was a lie, a clumsy, desperate lie, but it created a gray area. I saw Judge Holloway pause. She looked at the forged statement to Greg's sweaty face. It wasn't proof of innocence, but it was enough to create doubt about the financial timeline. A he said, she said situation regarding the source of funds was exactly what Thorne wanted. Thorne seized the moment of hesitation. Your Honor, given the complex nature of these commingled funds and Ms. Stark's attempt to hide the truth, we move for an immediate emergency injunction. We ask that all assets of Helix Dynamics be frozen pending a full forensic audit to protect my client's 50% interest. The room spun. Freezing the assets meant freezing operations. We had live cultures in the incubators for a new vaccine trial. They needed constant nutrient feeds and temperature regulation paid for by daily operating cash. If the accounts were frozen, the vendors would stop delivery. The cultures would die within 48 hours. The contracts would be voided. Helix Dynamics would cease to exist. I looked at Caleb. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked desperate, like a gambler doubling down on a losing hand. But Thorne looked triumphant. He knew that an asset freeze was a death sentence for a startup. He was holding a gun to my company's head, daring me to flinch. To understand why I am sitting here waiting for the hammer to fall, you have to understand what happened 2 weeks ago. The day Marcus Thorne threw those divorce papers on my conference table. He made a critical error. In his arrogance, he cited a specific number. He claimed I was hiding revenue because our third-quarter earnings were, and I quote, $4,800,000 higher than projected. That number stopped me cold. That report was draft only. It was encrypted on a secure server. Only the 3 members of the executive board had the decryption key. Caleb had never seen it. Thorne should not have known it exist. That night, after the office emptied out and the janitorial staff had finished their rounds, I sat alone in the glow of my monitor. I did not go home to cry. I went to work. I accessed the back end of our security system. I needed to know who the leak was. I filtered the access logs for the past month, looking for any unauthorized downloads of financial data. At 2 a.m, I found it. A user had accessed the secure drive at 11:45 at night on a Tuesday. The user ID belonged to Emlyn. Maya. My breath hitched in my throat. Maya was not just my executive assistant. I had trained her. I had paid off her student loans. I had treated her like the little sister I never had. I stared at the screen, willing it to be a mistake, a glitch, anything other than the truth. I pulled up the security camera footage from that night. The video was grainy, but the image was undeniable. There was Maya, sitting at my desk. She wasn't working. She was using her personal phone to take photographs of my computer screen. I watched, frozen in horror, as she finished snapping the pictures. She picked up her phone and typed a message. On the high-definition feed, I could see her smile. It was a flirtatious, secretive smile. She held the phone up to her face and blew a kiss to the screen before hitting send. I zoomed in on the frame where her phone screen was visible. The contact name at the top of her chat was not a boyfriend or a husband. It was Caleb. The realization hit me harder than the divorce papers. My husband was sleeping with my assistant. They were not just stealing my money. They were laughing at me while they did it. I felt a scream building in my chest, a raw, primal noise that wanted to tear through the silence of the office. But I swallowed it. I forced it down until it turned into something cold and hard in the pit of my stomach. You want to play games. Caleb, I whispered to the empty room. Let's play. I could have fired Maya the next morning. I could have had security escort her out. But that would only alert Caleb that I was on to them. It would make them cautious. I needed them greedy. I needed them reckless. I spent the rest of the night crafting a lie. I created a folder for a fictitious initiative I called Project Obsidian. I drafted fake term sheets, fabricated email chains, and created a mesmerizing narrative about a secret acquisition by a Swiss conglomerate. I valued the deal at $50 million. It was the perfect bait. Caleb was desperate for cash, and $50 million was enough money to make a smart man stupid and a stupid man fatal. The next morning, I walked into the office with a smile plastered on my face. I greeted Maya as if nothing had changed. "Good morning." "Maya," I said, handing her a coffee, "I need you to clear my schedule for the afternoon. I have a very sensitive meeting regarding the Obsidian file. It is strictly confidential." "Of course." "Eleanor," Maya said, her eyes widening slightly at the word confidential. "Is everything okay?" "Better than okay?" I said, leaning in close. "This is going to change everything for me. Just don't touch the folder on my desk." "All right." I placed the bright red folder labeled Project Obsidian Merger Documents right in the center of my desk. Then, I left for a lunch break I didn't need, leaving the door slightly ajar. I knew exactly what she would do. I was counting on it. Thorne was practically glowing with the energy of his own perceived brilliance. The stunt with Greg had worked better than he expected, planting a seed of doubt in Judge Holloway's mind. He paced in front of the bench, no longer just a lawyer arguing a case, but a predator who sensed blood in the water. I watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a lab rat navigate a maze, knowing exactly where the electric shock was waiting. "Your Honor," Thorne boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The issue of the seed money is troubling, but it is merely a symptom of a much larger pathology. Ms. Stark has painted herself as a struggling entrepreneur, but the reality is far more calculated. We have reason to believe she is currently in the process of liquidating marital assets to hide them offshore." I held my breath. I forced my shoulders to tense up visibly. I needed them to see fear. I needed them to believe that they had just cornered me. This was the moment I had scripted 2 weeks ago in the dark silence of my office. Thorne turned to face me, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "We have evidence that Ms. Stark is secretly transferring massive amounts of intellectual property to a holding entity in Switzerland. She is doing this under the codename Project Obsidian." The name hung in the air like smoke. Project Obsidian. I saw Caleb straighten up in his chair so fast his spine audibly popped, his eyes went wide, and for the first time all morning, he looked genuinely awake. I could practically see the calculator running behind his eyes. He wasn't thinking about justice. He was doing the math. Half of $50 million. $25 million. That was the number I had planted in the fake documents. He thought he was minutes away from being rich enough to buy the country club membership he had always been denied. Judge Holloway frowned, the lines on her forehead deepening. She turned her gaze to me, and it was heavy with suspicion. "Ms. Stark," she said, her voice sharp. "Are you currently engaged in an unreported merger or acquisition?" I stood up slowly. I let my hand knock against the water pitcher on the table, creating a clumsy clatter. I looked down at my shoes, then up at Caleb, then at the judge. I widened my eyes to simulate panic. "Your Honor, I cannot discuss that," I stammered, making sure my voice wavered just enough. "That project it is highly sensitive. It is under a strict non-disclosure agreement. How does Mr. Montgomery know that name?" Thorne laughed, a short, barking sound of triumph. He turned to the judge, spreading his arms wide. "You see, Your Honor, her reaction confirms it. She is shocked because she got caught. She is moving the company's most valuable assets to Europe to ensure my client gets nothing." "That is not true," I shouted, letting my voice crack. It is in the early stages. It is not finalized. I demand the immediate production of all files related to Project Obsidian." Thorne roared, sensing the kill. "If she is selling the company out from under my client, this court needs to see the terms immediately. This proves she is hiding tens of millions of dollars." Caleb was leaning forward now, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He looked like a starving dog staring at a steak. He was completely hooked. Judge Holloway looked at me, her expression unreadable but stern. Ms. Stark, if you are concealing a transaction of this magnitude, you are in serious violation of this court's standing financial orders. I want to see those documents. Do you have them? I hesitated. I looked at Sarah, who was playing her part perfectly, looking at me with confusion and concern. I have the preliminary files in my bag, I admitted quietly, dropping my head in defeat. But Your Honor, please. This could ruin the deal. The deal is the least of your worries right now, Judge Holloway snapped. She banged her gavel. Court is in recess for 30 minutes. Ms. Stark, you will use this time to organize those documents and present them to the court. If I find evidence of asset dissipation, I will hold you in contempt. All rise, the bailiff shouted. I collapsed back into my chair as the room broke into chaos. Thorne was high-fiving Caleb. They thought they had won. They thought they had just uncovered the golden goose. As the judge exited the chamber, I lowered my head to hide my face. But I wasn't crying. I was smiling. The trap was set, and they had just walked right into the center of it. The hallway outside the courtroom was buzzing with the nervous energy of a recess. I walked toward the water fountain, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I needed a moment to breathe, but Caleb was not going to give me that luxury. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path near the vending machines. He leaned in close, invading my personal space with the scent of expensive cologne and stale coffee. It does not have to end like this. Ellie, he whispered, his voice low and conspiratorial. You are backed into a corner. Just cut me in. Give me $20 million from the Obsidian deal, and I will tell Thorne to drop the suit. We can settle this today. I looked up at him, studying his face. The handsome features that had once charmed me now looked distorted by greed. I kept my expression blank, hiding the disgust churning in my stomach. $20 million, I asked, keeping my voice steady. Do you honestly think you deserve that kind of money? For what? Caleb. You have not worked a day in the last 5 years. Caleb chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He adjusted his tie, looking down at me with pity. I deserve it because I married you. I put up with your long hours and your obsession with that lab. You owe me. Eleanor. You owe me for my youth. You owe me for the prime years of my life that I wasted waiting for you to come home. It was the most honest thing he had said all day. He did not care about the company. He did not care about me. He just wanted a payout for the inconvenience of being married to a successful woman. How I asked softly, how did you even know about Project Obsidian? That file never left my office. Caleb smirked, tapping the side of his nose. I told you. Ellie, I am smarter than you think. I have eyes everywhere. You cannot hide anything from me. Not anymore. He was so proud of his espionage. He had no idea that his eyes were exactly what I had counted on. I nodded slowly, looking down at the floor as if I were accepting my defeat. Okay. Caleb, you win, if it is money you want. You will get exactly what you deserve when we go back in there. Smart girl, he said, patting my shoulder patronizingly. I knew you would see reason. He turned around and walked back to where Marcus Thorne and Greg were standing. I watched them from a distance. They were laughing, slapping each other on the back like a group of frat boys who had just pulled off a great prank. Thorne was checking his watch, probably calculating his contingency fee on a $25 million settlement. I turned away from them and walked over to Sarah, who was waiting by the window. She looked tense, her hand gripping the handle of her briefcase. He took the bait, I said quietly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick yellow envelope. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than just paper. It carried the weight of my freedom. I handed it to Sarah. It is time, I said. Sarah took the envelope. She opened the flap and slid the documents out just enough to see the headers. She scanned the first page, and slowly, a smile spread across her face. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a hunter who had just watched the trap snap shut around the wolf's leg. "This is beautiful," Sarah whispered. "Let's go finish this." We walked back into the courtroom. The atmosphere had changed. It was hotter, more suffocating. The gallery was fuller now. Several reporters had slipped in during the break, likely tipped off by Thorne's office about a massive financial scandal involving a local CEO. They were ready for a headline about embezzlement. I was about to give them a much better story. Judge Holloway returned to the bench. She looked impatient. She did not sit down immediately. She stood there, looming over the courtroom like a thundercloud. "Be seated," she commanded. The room went silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Judge Holloway fixed her gaze on me. "Ms. Stark, we are back on the record. Before the recess. Mr. Thorne made a serious allegation regarding hidden assets and an offshore merger known as Project Obsidian. I am ordering you to explain yourself. Are you, or are you not, moving assets to Switzerland?" I stood up. I picked up the yellow envelope from the table and walked toward the witness stand. I could feel Caleb's eyes on my back, burning with anticipation. He was ready to be rich. I took a deep breath and prepared to burn his world to the ground. I walked to the witness stand, the wood cool under my fingertips. I placed the yellow envelope in front of me like a shield. I did not look at the jury or the gallery. I looked directly at Judge Holloway. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Caleb was leaning forward, practically drooling over the prospect of the fortune he thought I was hiding. Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a smug look of satisfaction plastered on his face. "Your Honor," I began, keeping my voice level and calm. "Mr. Montgomery and his lawyer have accused me of embezzling funds and hiding assets through an entity called Project Obsidian. They have based these serious accusations entirely on documents they claim to possess." I turned my head slowly to look at Caleb. He blinked, unsure why I was engaging him directly. "However," I continued, my voice hardening, "I have a question for Mr. Montgomery. Where exactly did you acquire these documents? Did they arrive in our shared mailbox at home? Did you find them on the kitchen counter? Or did you obtain them from the private, encrypted server inside my corporate office?" Thorne shot up from his chair like he had been electrocuted. Objection. The source of our evidence is protected work product. The provenance is irrelevant. The content is what matters. Judge Holloway peered over her glasses. She did not look amused. Overruled. "Mr. Thorne, if you are accusing a CEO of international fraud, I need to know if the evidence was obtained legally. Proceed." "Ms. Stark." I reached into the yellow envelope. The sound of the paper sliding out seemed to echo in the room. I held up a single, crisp document. "The answer matters, Your Honor, because Project Obsidian is not a merger," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "It is not a sale. It is a digital honeypot protocol." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. I saw the color drain from Caleb's face. He looked at Thorne, but Thorne was staring at me, his brow furrowed. A honeypot Judge Holloway asked. "Yes," I explained. 2 weeks ago, I suspected I was the victim of industrial espionage. I believed someone was leaking confidential data from my office. So, I created Project Obsidian. It is a completely fabricated file. It contains nonsense numbers, gibberish financial projections, and technical drawings for a device that does not exist." The gallery erupted in whispers. Thorne looked down at the stack of papers in his hand, the ones he had been waving around all morning. "That is a lie," Thorne shouted, though his voice lacked its usual power. "These are complex schematics. We have reviewed them. Have you, I asked, pulling another sheet from my envelope. Because if you look at page 12 of the document you are holding, you will see a diagram labeled Thermal Regulation Turbine. Mr. Thorne, that is not a biotech component. That is the assembly schematic for the heating element of a Mr. Coffee machine from 1990. I just changed the file names. Laughter broke out in the back of the room. The judge banged her gavel, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. I watched Thorne frantically flip through his papers. He stopped at page 12. He stared at it. Then he looked at the diagram I was holding up. They were identical. The revolutionary technology he claimed I was selling to the Swiss was a 30-year-old coffee pot. Caleb looked like he was going to be sick. The smirk was gone, replaced by the terrified realization that the $25 million he thought he was getting had just evaporated into thin air. But the comedy of the content is secondary to the method of retrieval, I said, driving the final nail into the coffin. This file was not on the cloud. It was not emailed. It was placed in a local offline folder on my desktop. It had no network connection. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. To possess these documents, Your Honor, someone had to physically enter my office, bypass my security, and manually copy the files from my hard drive. That means the plaintiff did not just find evidence. He, or his accomplice, committed a felony. They committed corporate data theft. Thorne dropped the papers on the table. He looked at Caleb with pure hatred. The narrative of the poor, cheated husband had just been replaced by the reality of a criminal conspiracy. And I was just getting started. I reached into the yellow envelope for the second time. The room was already buzzing from the revelation about the coffee machine schematics. But I was not done. I pulled out a sheet of paper that was dense with lines of code and timestamps. It was a server access log, the digital fingerprint of a crime. This document is the system access log for the terminal in my private office, I stated, my voice echoing off the walls. It proves that the file named Project Obsidian was opened and copied to an external drive at 11:45 at night on Tuesday of last week. At that hour, the building was closed. I was at home. Sarah plugged her laptop into the courtroom's audio-visual system. The large screen behind the witness stand flickered to life. It showed the black and white feed from the security camera in my office. The timestamp in the corner matched the log perfectly. "Please watch closely," I said. On the screen, the door to my office opened. A figure walked in. It was not a shadow. The face was clearly visible in the glow of the monitor. It was Maya Lin, my trusted assistant. A collective gasp went through the gallery. The video showed her sitting at my desk, her hands moving quickly as she plugged a USB drive into the tower. "She is stealing the file," I narrated coldly. But she made a mistake. You can see her pick up her mobile phone to make a call, but the screen is dark. Her battery was dead. So, she did what anyone in a hurry would do. She picked up the landline on my desk. I looked at Caleb. He was shaking his head, his mouth opening and closing like he was gasping for air. My office phones are part of a voice-over IP system. I explained to the judge, every call is automatically recorded and stored on the cloud for compliance purposes. I have that recording right here. I nodded to Sarah. She pressed the spacebar on her laptop. The audio filled the courtroom, crystal clear and damning. "I got it." "Caleb," Maya's voice said, breathless and excited. "I have the file, the $50 million project. You promised me 10%. Right. That is $5 million for me." There was a pause on the recording. Then a male voice answered. It was a voice everyone in the room recognized. It was the voice of the man currently sitting at the plaintiff's table. "Good job, babe," Caleb's recorded voice said, dripping with arrogance. "Get it and wipe the traces. That fool Eleanor won't know a thing. We are going to be rich." The silence that followed the recording was shattered by a scream. Caleb jumped up from his chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. His face was a mask of pure panic. "That is fake. That is AI. She edited the voice. I never said that order." Judge Holloway shouted, her voice booming like thunder. She slammed her gavel down with such force I thought the handle would snap. "Mr. Montgomery," Sit down immediately, or I will have you restrained. She is framing me, Caleb yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. It is a setup. Two bailiffs stepped forward, hands on their holsters, effectively silencing him. Caleb sank back into his chair, looking small and defeated. Beside him, Marcus Thorne looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was an ashen gray. He realized the ship was sinking, and he was trying to figure out how to jump off without drowning. He stood up, his movements jerky. Your Honor, Thorne stammered, his smooth confidence completely gone. If Ms. Lynn acted illegally, she did so independently. My client was, perhaps he was misled. He is a victim of manipulation here as much as anyone else. I looked at Thorne, and I let a cold smile touch my lips. He was trying to sever the limb to save the body, but it was too late. Mr. Thorne, I said, cutting him off. You just submitted the Obsidian file as Exhibit A. You authenticated it. You told this court that these documents were legitimate proof of my assets. You cannot introduce stolen property as evidence and then claim your client didn't know where it came from. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the lawyer. You are holding the fruit of the poisonous tree, Mr. Thorne, and by submitting it to this court, you just made yourself an accessory to the crime. Judge Holloway looked like she was about to incinerate the defense table with her eyes. There is a specific kind of anger reserved for judges who realize their courtroom is being used as a stage for a crime, and Caleb and Thorne were currently standing center stage. The silence in the room was heavy, vibrating with the kind of tension that comes before a lightning strike. I reached into the yellow envelope one last time. My hand brushed against the bottom. It was empty now. I had played every card I had, but this final one was the ace of spades. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady and loud enough to reach the back row where the reporters were frantically taking notes. Mr. Thorne claims his client was an innocent victim of my assistant's rogue actions. He claims ignorance, but I have one final document that proves otherwise. I held up a printout of an email. This is an email sent from Caleb Montgomery's personal account to Marcus Thorne's secure law firm address. I continued. It is dated Wednesday morning, less than 8 hours after the theft occurred. The attachment is the stolen Obsidian file. I paused, letting the jury and the judge lean in. The subject line reads, Ammo to take down the bitch. Caleb flinched as if I had slapped him. How did you get that? Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking. That is privileged attorney-client communication. Sarah stepped forward, cool as a winter morning. Actually, it is not. We obtained this email through a subpoena granted 3 days ago by a federal magistrate, based on probable cause of industrial espionage. Since the communication involves the commission of a crime specifically, the transfer of stolen trade secrets, the privilege does not apply. It is admissible. Sarah turned to the judge, her posture rigid and commanding. Your Honor, Mr. Montgomery has not only committed adultery with the witness Maya Lynn, he has committed corporate espionage, theft of trade secrets, and fraud upon this court. He knowingly submitted stolen, fabricated evidence to destroy my client's reputation and seize assets he had no right to touch. Judge Holloway turned her gaze slowly toward Caleb. It was a look of absolute disgust. Mr. Montgomery, the judge said, her voice dangerously low. You did not just attempt to defraud your wife. You attempted to defraud me. You brought stolen, forged documents into my courtroom and presented them as fact. Chaos erupted at the defense table. Marcus Thorne, realizing his career was flashing before his eyes, began shoving papers into his briefcase. His face was slick with sweat. Your Honor, Thorne yelled over the noise. I must request to withdraw as counsel. Immediately, I was not made aware of the origin of these files. My client assured me they were legitimate. I cannot represent a client who misleads counsel and compromises my standing with the Bar Association. Sit down, Mr. Thorne, the judge barked, but the damage was done. The alliance was shattered. Caleb stood there, alone. The charming, confident man who had walked in here expecting a payday was gone. In his place was a trembling coward. His narcissism, which had armored him for so long, fractured under the weight of consequences. He looked at Thorne, then at the judge, and finally, his eyes locked on me. Panic took over. It was not me, Caleb stammered, pointing a shaking finger at his lawyer. It is Thorne. He told me to do it. And Maya, she is crazy. She did this on her own. I just wanted what was fair. He was pathetic. He was throwing everyone under the bus to save himself. Then, he did the one thing I knew he would do. He tried to charm the victim. He walked toward the railing, tears streaming down his face. Ellie, baby, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Please, you know me. I was pressured. I was confused. I just want us to go back to how we were. I love you. Don't do this to me. I looked at him, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just the hollow realization that I had wasted 5 years on a mirage. You made your choice. Caleb, I said, my voice cutting through his sobbing like a knife. You signed your own sentence the moment you told your lawyer to throw those papers in my face in front of my employees. You wanted a war. You lost. Judge Holloway slammed her gavel down, a sound of finality that echoed like a gunshot. Enough, she declared. I am suspending these divorce proceedings immediately. This is no longer a civil matter. I am referring this entire file, including the testimony of Ms. Stark and the evidence presented, to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Prosecution. Judge Holloway did not waste a single second. She did not even retreat to her chambers to deliberate. She simply stacked her papers, looked down at the defense table, and delivered a verdict that felt like a guillotine blade dropping. In light of the overwhelming evidence of fraud, perjury, and criminal intent, Judge Holloway announced, her voice echoing with absolute authority, I am issuing a summary judgment regarding the civil portion of this case immediately. Mr. Montgomery, your request for 50% of Helix Dynamics is denied with prejudice. You will receive $0 in spousal support. Furthermore, I am invoking the doctrine of unclean hands to void any claim you might have had to marital assets. You attempted to use this court as an instrument of theft, and, in doing so, you have forfeited your rights to the estate. Caleb slumped in his chair. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. But the nightmare was not over for him. Bailiff, the judge said, pointing a sharp finger at my husband. Take Mr. Montgomery into custody. He is to be held for the Seattle Police Department on charges of corporate espionage, grand larceny, and perjury. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward. They pulled Caleb up by his arms. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest music I had ever heard. Ellie, please, Caleb cried out, struggling weakly against the officers. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Tell them to stop. I did not answer him. I just watched as they dragged him toward the side door. He was no longer the arrogant man who had belittled my dreams. He was just a criminal. Judge Holloway then turned her gaze to Marcus Thorne. The lawyer was hurriedly packing his briefcase, trying to make himself invisible. Mr. Thorne, the judge said, stopping him in his tracks. Do not leave this building. I am filing an immediate referral to the Washington State Bar Association. You submitted fabricated evidence without due diligence. You are looking at disbarment, sir. Sit down and wait for the authorities. Thorne collapsed back into his chair, putting his head in his hands. The court clerk approached me. Ms. Stark, do you have any further evidence to submit before we close the record? I looked down at the yellow envelope in my hand. It was empty now. I had fired every bullet I had. I handed the hollow envelope to the clerk. No, I said softly. That is everything. It is done. As I turned to leave the courtroom, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from the head of security at my office. It was a photo of Maya Lynn being escorted out of the building in handcuffs by two police officers. The text read, "The mole has been removed. We are secure." I walked out of the heavy double doors of the courtroom and into the main lobby. The air inside had been stifling, but as I pushed through the exit and stepped onto the sidewalk, the rush of fresh air filled my lungs. I looked up. It was a rare day in Seattle. The gray clouds had parted, revealing a brilliant, piercing blue sky. I took a deep breath, tasting freedom for the first time in 5 years. There was no Caleb to criticize me. There was no Thorn to threaten me. There was no Maya to spy on me. There was only me and the empire I had built. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my R&D lab. The lead scientist picked up on the first ring. "Eleanor, is everything okay?" "Everything is perfect," I said, walking toward my car. "Delete the Obsidian file. The fake project has served its purpose. I want the team to start the intake for the real vaccine trials immediately. We have work to do." I hung up and slid into the driver's seat of my car. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I did not see a victim. I saw a CEO. I saw a woman who had walked into a fire and came out holding the match. I started the engine, the roar of the motor drowning out the memory of Caleb's pleading voice. I shifted into gear and drove away, leaving the courthouse and my past in the rearview mirror where they belonged. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on Caleb's punishment. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so more people can hear this story.